Nobody in that room saw it coming. The cameras were rolling, the microphones were live, and in front of a watching world, J.D. Vance looked directly at Emmanuel Macron and said something so brutal, so coldly precise, that the French president's own advisors couldn't hide their reaction. This was not a slip. This was not an off-script moment that Vance later walked back. This was calculated, deliberate, and timed to land at exactly the moment when France thought it had the upper hand. Paris had spent weeks positioning Macron as the leader of European resistance to Washington, the man who would stand up to Trump's America and speak for a continent that had lost faith in its oldest ally. That entire strategy just collapsed in real time, because what Vance did in those minutes didn't just embarrass Macron personally. It exposed the one thing France has been desperately trying to hide, that behind all the grand speeches about European sovereignty, Paris has no leverage, no plan, and no answer to the new Washington. And the move that followed the humiliation was so unexpected that even America's closest European allies are now privately asking whether the transatlantic alliance they thought they understood still exists at all. To understand exactly what J.D. Vance just did to Emmanuel Macron, and why Paris is reacting with a fury it cannot even fully express in public, you have to understand what Macron had been building for the 6 weeks leading up to this moment. Because this was not a random confrontation. This was the destruction of a very carefully constructed political performance, executed in front of the one audience Macron could least afford to be humiliated before. Since the early months of 2025, Emmanuel Macron had been running what his own advisors privately called a repositioning strategy. The core idea was simple on paper and extraordinarily difficult in practice. France would position itself as the indispensable bridge between a fractured Europe and an unpredictable Washington. Macron would be the one European leader who could still get a meeting, still command respect, still pick up the phone and have it answered. While other EU leaders were scrambling to understand what Trump's second term meant for their security arrangements, their trade relationships, and their political futures, Macron was projecting confidence. He gave speeches in Warsaw, Berlin, and Brussels, always with the same message: Europe needs a voice. France is that voice, and Macron is the man who speaks it. The strategy required one thing above everything else: the appearance of a working relationship with the American administration. Not warmth, not agreement on every issue, just a visible, credible sense that when Macron walked into a room with Washington's representatives, he was treated as an equal, that he had access, that he had influence, that Paris mattered to the people now running American foreign policy. For months, Macron managed to maintain that appearance through a combination of carefully staged diplomatic visits, selectively released readouts of phone calls, and a masterful control of the French media narrative. His team made sure that every interaction with Washington, no matter how brief and no matter how inconclusive, was packaged and presented as evidence that France remained at the center of transatlantic diplomacy. European leaders watched this performance with a mixture of skepticism and grudging respect. Whatever you thought of Macron, the man knew how to control a story. Then J.D. Vance arrived, and in the space of one live exchange, the entire architecture Macron had spent 6 weeks constructing came apart at the foundation. What happened in those minutes was not a disagreement. It was not a heated debate between two leaders with different views who nonetheless respected each other's positions. What Vance delivered was something far more damaging: a public reclassification. He treated Macron not as a peer, not as an ally with legitimate concerns, not even as a rival worth engaging seriously. He treated him as a regional administrator who had misunderstood his role. The specific words Vance used, which immediately circulated across European diplomatic channels within hours of the exchange, carried a message that every foreign ministry on the continent decoded instantly. Washington no longer considers Paris a first-tier interlocutor on the questions that actually matter. And the way Vance said it, without raising his voice, without visible irritation, with the flat calm of a man stating an obvious fact, made it land harder than any shouted accusation ever could. Macron's response in the moment was visibly controlled. The kind of frozen composure that senior politicians deploy when they are absorbing a blow they did not anticipate and cannot immediately answer. His press team, watching from the side of the room, immediately understood what had just happened. The readout they had planned to release, emphasizing French influence and highlighting areas of productive dialogue, carefully worded to project equivalence between the two sides, was now unusable. Whatever they published, the footage existed. And footage, in the era of 12-second clips and instant global distribution, is the only thing that matters. Within 45 minutes of the exchange ending, the first clips were already spreading across European political social media. By the time French state television addressed it that evening, the framing had already been set by everyone else. Macron had been dismissed. Macron had been diminished. And the man who had spent 6 weeks telling Europe that France could manage Washington had just been shown on camera in real time that Washington had a completely different view of what France was worth. The fury that erupted inside the Élysée Palace in the hours that followed was, by multiple accounts from people with direct knowledge of those conversations, unlike anything the current staff had witnessed in years. Not because of what Vance said, though that was damaging enough, but because of what it meant for everything Macron had been trying to build. One senior French official, speaking to a European counterpart that same evening, described the situation with a single sentence: "We have been using a map that Washington threw away months ago." That sentence captures the real crisis beneath the visible humiliation. Because if France has been operating on assumptions about its relationship with Washington that Washington no longer shares, then every calculation Paris has made about European security, NATO's future, the war in Ukraine, and trade negotiations is now built on a foundation that does not exist. But here is what Paris does not yet know, and what makes the situation dramatically worse than even the humiliation itself suggests. The exchange between Vance and Macron was not the actual move, it was the cover for something happening simultaneously in a completely different room, involving a completely different set of actors that Paris had no knowledge of whatsoever. And when that second move becomes public, as it inevitably will, the question every European leader will be forced to ask is not whether France has lost influence in Washington. The question will be whether France was deliberately kept out of the room while decisions about Europe's future were being made without it. So what was happening in that other room, and which European leader was inside it while Macron was being humiliated on camera? The other room was in Washington, not the West Wing, not the State Department's formal reception halls where visiting European dignitaries are usually processed through the standard choreography of handshakes and group photographs. This was a private meeting, no press pool, no official readout, no advance notice to allied governments. And the European leader sitting across from senior American officials while Macron was being publicly diminished on camera was someone Paris had specifically been trying to sideline for months. The meeting had been arranged through back channels that bypassed the normal EU coordination mechanisms entirely, which meant that by the time French intelligence picked up even a fragmentary indication that it had taken place, the conversation was already over and the agreements reached inside it were already being implemented. Washington had not just humiliated Macron in public. Washington had replaced him in private. And the replacement was someone whose entire political identity is built on the proposition that France's vision of European leadership is not just wrong, but actively dangerous to the continent's future. The details of what was discussed in that Washington meeting are still emerging, but what is already confirmed through multiple European diplomatic sources is significant enough to explain the full scale of Paris's fury. The discussion covered 3 specific areas that Macron had been treating as exclusively French domains: the framework for any future Ukraine ceasefire negotiations, the restructuring of European defense procurement away from American dependency, and the question of which European capitals Washington would treat as primary contacts for transatlantic security coordination going forward. These are not peripheral issues. These are the 3 pillars on which Macron's entire European leadership strategy rests. And in each of these 3 areas, the Washington meeting produced outcomes that directly contradict the French position, outcomes that were reached without France being present, without France being consulted, and without France being informed until after the fact. That is not a diplomatic oversight. That is a deliberate architectural decision about who matters and who does not. To understand why this particular combination of topics is so devastating for Paris, you need to understand what Macron has staked his presidency on at the European level. Since 2017, when he arrived at the Élysée with the most ambitious European agenda of any French leader since Charles de Gaulle, Macron has been operating on a single foundational assumption: that France is the indispensable strategic brain of the European project. Germany provides the economic weight. France provides the strategic direction. Every major initiative Macron has launched at the EU level, European strategic autonomy, the push for a European defense industrial base, the proposal for European nuclear deterrence conversations, flows from this central premise: France thinks, Europe follows. And Washington, whatever its complaints about burden sharing and trade imbalances, ultimately needs France at the table, because no serious European security architecture can be built without French strategic participation. J.D. Vance just told the world that Washington disagrees, not in a policy paper, not in a diplomatic cable that could be managed and quietly absorbed, but on camera, and then backed it up with a private meeting that proved the disagreement was not rhetorical but operational. Washington is not just skeptical of French leadership. Washington is actively constructing an alternative to it, one that roots around Paris, builds relationships with European capitals that have historically been junior partners in the French-led vision of continental order, and treats Macron's grand strategic frameworks not as the foundation of transatlantic cooperation, but as obstacles to the more direct transactional relationships the current American administration prefers. The European capitals that received quiet briefings about the Washington meeting in the 24 hours that followed reacted with a mixture of alarm and something that a number of French analysts, watching the responses come in, described with visible discomfort as relief. Because several governments that had spent years chafing under the assumption that France spoke for Europe on security matters, governments in Warsaw, Stockholm, and The Hague, now saw confirmation of something they had suspected but never been able to state openly. Washington was willing to hear their voices directly, without the French filter. That shift in access is not a small thing. Access is the currency of international influence, and Macron had been controlling a significant portion of Europe's access to Washington for years. That control just ended. And the question now tearing through European foreign ministries is not whether the French-led security architecture can survive this blow. It cannot, at least not in its current form. The real question is what replaces it, how fast the replacement happens, and who ends up holding the pieces when the restructuring is complete. But none of that is the detail keeping Macron's inner circle awake at 3 a.m. The strategic reorientation is damaging. The public humiliation is painful. The private Washington meeting is a diplomatic catastrophe. All of that is recoverable, slowly, expensively, and with significant political cost, but recoverable. What is not recoverable, what represents a genuinely irreversible shift in France's position, is the specific language that came out of Washington in the 48 hours after Vance's exchange with Macron. Because senior American officials, not anonymously, not through intermediaries, but on the record, used a phrase to describe France's role in European security that no American administration has ever used before. And that phrase, once spoken at that level and in that context, changes the entire framework through which every European government will now calculate its relationship with Paris. So what exactly did Washington say? And why are 3 former French foreign ministers now privately saying it may be the most damaging thing an American administration has said about France since 1966? The phrase that came out of Washington was 4 words. Just 4 words delivered by a senior American official during a background briefing with a small group of journalists who had been specifically invited to hear it. A deliberate leak dressed as an informal conversation. The oldest and most precise instrument in the Washington communications toolkit. The 4 words were, France is not essential, not hostile, not wrong, not misguided, not a difficult partner whose concerns needed to be managed. Essential. The specific choice of that word, its negation, its clinical flatness, the complete absence of any diplomatic cushioning around it, was not accidental. Everyone in that briefing room understood immediately that they were not hearing an off-the-cuff remark from a tired official. They were hearing a verdict, a formal reassessment communicated through the most deniable channel available of France's structural position in the American strategic worldview. And within 6 hours of that briefing ending, the phrase had reached every major European foreign ministry, every NATO planning office, and every senior correspondent covering transatlantic affairs. By morning, it was the only thing anyone in European diplomatic circles was talking about. The reason 3 former French foreign ministers reacted with such visible alarm is rooted in a specific piece of history that every serious French diplomat carries with them as a kind of permanent warning. In 1966, Charles de Gaulle withdrew France from NATO's integrated military command, a decision that shocked Washington, destabilized the alliance, and redefined the terms of transatlantic relations for a generation. De Gaulle's calculation was that France's independence was worth the cost of American anger. He was right in the narrow sense that France survived the rupture and eventually rebuilt its relationship with Washington on terms it found more acceptable. But the cost was enormous, and the recovery took decades. What the current situation represents is the inverse of that 1966 moment. Not France choosing to step back from American structures, but America choosing to step back from France. De Gaulle made a sovereign decision. Macron is experiencing an external verdict, and external verdicts in international relations are categorically harder to reverse, because the party delivering them has no incentive to change its position simply because the party receiving it finds it uncomfortable. What makes the American move so surgically effective is its timing relative to two events that are now converging in ways Paris cannot control. The first is the ongoing negotiation over Ukraine's future, where France had positioned itself as an essential broker between European unity and American pressure, a position that now has no foundation if Washington does not consider France essential to begin with. The second is the European Parliament's upcoming debate on defense spending commitments, where Macron had planned to use French strategic credibility with Washington as leverage to push through a framework that would significantly expand French defense industry contracts across the continent. Both of those strategies require the same prerequisite, that other European governments believe France has genuine influence in Washington. That prerequisite just evaporated, and without it, Macron is not just weakened diplomatically. He is politically exposed at home in ways that his domestic opponents are already moving to exploit with a speed and precision that suggests they had been waiting for exactly this moment. The final dimension of this crisis, the one that transforms it from a serious diplomatic setback into a potentially historic inflection point, is what it reveals about the new architecture of American engagement with Europe. J.D. Vance did not humiliate Macron because he dislikes France. He did it because the current American administration has made a strategic calculation that the old European order, built around Franco-German consensus, Brussels' institutional process, and the assumption that Washington would always ultimately defer to its traditional partners, is not just outdated, but actively obstructive to American interests in a fundamentally changed world. The new American engagement with Europe is bilateral, transactional, and deliberately asymmetric. It rewards governments that align with Washington's immediate priorities. It sidelines governments that prioritize European institutional process over direct American demands. And it uses public humiliation not as a failure of diplomacy, but as a tool of it, a visible signal to every other European capital about the cost of positioning yourself against Washington's preferences. Macron walked into that exchange believing he was managing a difficult ally. He walked out having been used as an example, and every European leader watching from the outside understood the message with perfect clarity. The rules of transatlantic engagement have changed. France did not change with them. And the government that figures out the new rules fastest will inherit the influence that Paris just lost. The only question left, the one that will define European politics for the next decade, is whether any European leader is bold enough or desperate enough to make that move before Washington makes it for them.